Hi, everyone. It's the Catholic CEO, Henry Katarna. Welcome to the Catholic Business Wisdom Leaders Series. It's very important that we talk to Catholic leaders who are exemplary in their performance of the faith. And so today we have a very special guest, Dr. Samuel Klumpenhouwer, and he is a teacher and a scholar and a father and a husband. And I'm really happy that you're with us today, Dr. Klumpenhouwer. How are you today?
Doing well. Glad to be here.
That's great. That's great. Well, let's get right into the important topic at hand, which is tell us about your faith journey. First of all, that's something that our audience is always interested in. What's the story of your Catholic faith?
So I was raised in Canada and grew up there as a Protestant. Grew up in a large family on a farm up in Ontario, and I had a wonderful upbringing and benefited greatly from that environment. When I went off to Bible college, Protestant Bible college, I became increasingly interested in church history, which led me on an intellectual journey and eventually a faith journey that culminated in 2010 in becoming Catholic. I was 24 at the time in university in Toronto at that point, and I became a Catholic and have never looked back since. And my family has been very supportive and understanding, thankfully, and as well. At the same time as that faith journey was going on, and it was mostly going on with books. It was only later really that I became involved in the Catholic community in Toronto, and then I live now in Texas, down here. But at the same time that faith journey was going on, I was also studying history and increasingly specializing in medieval history. And so those two things, both my conversion and my interest in medieval history, converged, and they've been together ever since. And so a lot of my time now is as a Catholic, but also one as with a special appreciation for medieval Catholicism. And I work now and very involved in a church school down in Texas. So I'm again, the Lord has blessed me with a great Catholic community, and it's a beautiful life.
It's great. I love to hear it. Dr. Klumpenauer, it's interesting. Many of our guests are their conversion story is either the intellectual route or it's something to do with a profound experience, getting knocked off the horse, so to speak. So you've come through the intellectual route, and I know that you have a doctorate, and so is that intellectual route part of the medieval history that you appreciate so much? Is that part of your faith journey as well? Is that a combination of things?
In many ways, they were happening parallel to each other. It was not, they were happening at the same time. And when I tell the story, it seems reasonable to think that they were related, as one causing the other. But really, they were happening parallel. Both my interest in the church and my interest in medieval history, they supported each other. But I think I'd be Catholic even if I wasn't interested in that type of history. That said, many of the first Catholics I knew were, even though I was at a public university in Toronto at this point in time after the Protestant Bible College, many of my professors were Catholic, teaching me medieval history. And so they certainly helped along the way, even if they didn't initiate the process.
Right. And so when you have a doctorate in a topic like medieval history, what's some of the research that you've done? What have you delved into?
So I've spent a lot of my time with practical skills, trying to make these sources from the Middle Ages available to a modern audience, because there are many books, probably by it's estimated probably 80% of the material from the Middle Ages has never been seriously studied, let alone translated. And so there's a lot of work to be done making these resources available to a modern audience, whether in new editions or translations. And so that's where a lot of my time is in translating and editing medieval works. Most especially, there's a standard Bible commentary from the Middle Ages called the Glossa Ordinaria. If anyone has ever reading Thomas Aquinas, you'll within 10 minutes probably you'll come across a citation in the Summa to the gloss says or so forth. And this is that Bible commentary that Thomas is citing all the time that's not been translated yet. So a lot of my time with that is spent making either biblical commentaries available to the modern audience or other materials somehow related to the church.
And I presume you're a published author in some areas.
That's right. So I'm working with the St. Paul Center up in Steubenville. We have a series making this translation available. We have a 1 volume published, a few in the works, and then we hope to complete the whole volume over the next decade or so, which will run about 20 volumes by the time we're done.
It sounds like a lifetime project. In some ways, yeah. So, Dr. Klumpenhouwer, when you're dealing with students, then, so you're transmitting knowledge, you're taking some of the learnings from the medieval period, and you're making it available to a modern audience, which I presume is your students as well. And so, how do they take this? It seems like a topic that you don't hear about often. Someone who is a PhD in medieval studies. It's not that common. But you're in front of students, and so how do they take this? What do they take in as information from you and learning?
Surprisingly, they take it surprisingly well. For a long time, it was very difficult for modern man to understand the Middle Ages. Just modern man thought in a more analytic way than people in the Middle Ages. They were certainly analytic thinkers in the Middle Ages, but it was hard for modern man to understand medieval images and medieval symbology and so forth. But increasingly, in a postmodern era, and especially for me, actually, because I teach children, and I find that the children are surprisingly able to understand and appreciate how the medievals thought. So, for instance, I teach, even though I teach middle school, I teach them at one point in the curriculum Dante's Purgatorio. And through that, I teach them about the medieval cosmos, the medieval way of looking at the cosmos, and so forth. And they are surprisingly, it's intuitive to the people in the Middle Ages, but also to students of today, and they can appreciate the beauty and the unity of how people viewed the world. So I'd say surprisingly well, and I think that's a great opportunity for people who do study the Middle Ages, that they have a lot to offer postmodern man, so to speak, because in many ways we think very similar now, increasingly so, to people in the Middle Ages.
Mm-hmm. So you're in a Catholic school system, if I understand correctly, and so let's say if you compare or contrast that with let's say the public education system, where again I'm not sure that the topics you speak about might be on the curriculum at all. Is there a difference, and what does it do in the end for the student when they, grow up and get older and go off to college or into the workforce?
Mm-hmm. I can't speak from personal experience because I've not taught in the public system. Now, I went to a public high school, but it was a good education 20 years ago. But I know much has changed, so I can't speak to the current situation too much in the public system, but just my impression of what I hear is that it's very focused on the moment, and it's political, and it's spends a lot of time talking about kind of the latest intellectual trends that are going on, whether it was sexuality or politics or whatever else. Whereas I'm really trying to step away from that. I try not to get into what is happening in the world right now when I'm teaching my students, because I know by time they're of maturity, by the time they're voting age, it'll be a different situation. And so I'm trying to teach them eternal things. And maybe that's the biggest difference here, is that I'm really focusing, I'm trying to step outside of the current moment and teach them things that have been true about the nature of man forever, that are inherent in the nature of man, and how he thinks and how he works. And also to give them appreciation of the past. And again, students, I think, appreciate that, and they also appreciate, what would you say? It's you can kind of talk about the past in more in depth, because it's less contentious and emotional, because it's not the current argument going on, and so you can kind of delve into issues deeper, when you approach them from a historical perspective.
Mm-hmm. These timeless, in a sense, they're timeless topics that you speak of. And so when you do that, and you're talking about, it's about the past, but the idea is that these situations and the process of thought applies in our current situation. So what happens? I'm looking with interest at what happens to a student when they come through, let's say your class and other classes that are similar to yours in the school system. Do they have, critical thinking skills? That's a buzzword you hear all the time. That people come up with critical thinking skills. What do they come out with? What is the profile of the student that comes out after they go through the Dr. Klumpenhouwer system, shall we say?
I have no idea, and I don't even know what the goal is. Really, I don't have a specific profile that I'm aiming for. Well, in many regards, certainly when it comes to, say, the mechanics of grammar and some of those things like that, is because I teach many different subjects: history, literature, religion, Latin. And so yes, there is some specifics in terms of what they need to know when they leave my class, in terms of English and Latin language. But in a more general sense, in terms of their ideology, I mean, I'm hoping that they're coming out with a love for the church, but I try not to have too specific of a vision for each child, because again, I'm planting seeds, and how exactly they're going to grow throughout their life, I'm not sure. And I don't want to try to force it too much. Really, I'm just trying to plant seeds of virtue and let them flower as they will. And so I'm hoping, in other words, that my students come out with a great flowering of diversity in whatever, whether they end up as a plumber or as an academic. I'm trying to prepare students for either of those paths.
That profile, and I understand what you're saying. You're not seeking to, pigeonhole a student into a particular set of criteria. But in the Catholic CEO, when we work with business people, we are consultants largely, and we work with not-for-profit organizations as well as business. And also we work with people who are employees in, say, corporate America. And they're all searching for virtue. The reason that our clients come to us is because they want to do better in business. Yes, they want to accelerate their performance and be successful and provide income for their families and employment and so on and so on, all the good things in that sense. But they all search for virtue. And so I'm assuming that this is correct because I see it with different people that we work with. So a student that comes through, and is fortunate to be, let's say, in your class, I presume they're going to come into the business world with, we would hope, some kind of more penetrating virtue in their life, and therefore exemplify the Catholic faith in whatever they're doing. So what about the evangelization? Do you find that your students, if you've tracked some of them, perhaps, do they end up greater virtue and more evangelization skills or techniques, do you think?
I would hope so. It's a little skewed because the students that I see after they graduate, the students that I see around the parish in the following years as they go through high school are going to naturally be the students that have really taken things to heart. And the students who haven't taken things to heart often, I never see them again. So it's hard for me to judge overall, because some students I never see again, and I'm not sure what that means. Maybe they moved, maybe they switched to a different parish. I'm not sure.
Right.
But I mean, it's a thing of virtue as well. I mean, at the end of the day, it of course has to be chosen. It's an act of the will on the part of the students, and I'm trying to encourage them to make those choices. And as a teacher, you desire, but you can't force your students to be virtuous, and that's always the thing. And that's always, as a teacher as well, it's, you have the authority to make things happen in the classroom, but at the end of the day, you don't want to have to make students choose to do the good, because you want them to choose in such a way that they're going to do it even if you're not present in the room. And so, it's what to say. It's a heavy weight as a teacher, and it's in many ways more important, of course, than the English grammar, so on. I mean, I would rather be a student virtuous and bad at grammar than the other way around, certainly.
Exactly. And so, God gave us all free will. And so I think that's where you're heading, perhaps. You can do your best as a teacher and as a scholar to impart knowledge and virtue, but still the acceptance of it is on the part of you're the transmitter, you might say, and the receiver has to accept that. And so let's think about families then, Dr. Klumpenhauer. Families are worried today. I hear lots of people both in the U.S. and Canada talk to me about the kids stop practicing the faith. They go off to college, or they go, they receive the sacrament of confirmation, and then that's it for them. They stop practicing the faith, and parents are dismayed, mightily dismayed about this. Um, what advice do you have for parents in that situation? You see their students, so to speak, their children, and yet, as best as you can do, and as best as parents do, they sometimes, some cases, children will stop practicing the faith, and they may come back later. They may have that conversion experience we talked about, or the intellectual approach. But what advice is there? Anything you can say to parents to help to keep kids in the faith?
Mm-hmm. Yes, and that's a heavy burden on a lot of parents,
Yeah.
and it's tragic, of course, and it's also something you can't control. Again, you want to be able to make those choices for your students, but there comes a point, and you can make them up to a certain age. You can make them go to mass up to a certain age, but when they're off in college, there comes a point when they have to make those choices themselves. I will say this, that it is a temptation to take what I just said and apply it too early. Some parents think that, say their child is 10 years old, and if they say they don't want to go to mass, and the parent is worried that if they force them to go to mass, then they'll react too strongly against that, and not want to practice the faith. And so the parents are, in a way, at those young ages, the parents are sometimes too reluctant to have their child participate in the life of the church. And I would say that's not a good approach. I mean, you at that age, at that young age, you are still the parent. They are still under your authority, and it is certainly appropriate to have them come to mass and other devotional things that you might do. It is true, yes, when they get to a certain age as an adult, they need to internalize these things and take ownership of them themselves. But there is a long process where you are there as part of their process. So don't put that choice too early in their life, that personal choice. Don't allow them to make that choice too early. And so certainly continue bringing them to mass as much as you can. Of course, it's also certainly your own prayers that you must continue, and also living the virtuous life themselves. I mean, often,
Yes.
Parents who are in those situations, sometimes they're wonderful servants of the Lord, and really it's tragic, but other times, those things happen as a result of seeing the parents not take things seriously in their faith either. And so again, you can do what you can do. Of course, at the end of the day, is the child's free will is involved in this. But again, you have, as parents, as teachers, a role in informing that child in virtue, informing them in making the right choices. But yes, it's part of the tragedy of our times that this story is so common.
Yeah, exactly. You also have reminded me that you teach many subjects, and one of them is Latin. So I went to a Jesuit high school back in the day of the classical Jesuits, because I'm of a certain age. And the study of Latin, for example, at the time, even among my peers, there were critics, said, "Well, why are you doing Latin?" Well, it has helped me incredibly in not only my knowledge of history, because of the way that the Latin was taught to us, but just the comprehension of the English language. And I did a little bit of French as well. And so, I guess I'm not feeding you a leading question here, but Latin and a study of that, I think, is a very important topic. And so what would be your thoughts on that?
Yes, and indeed, even at my school, our textbook is one of the great Jesuit textbooks. Henley, who was a Jesuit back at quite time, we use his textbook. Now, Latin is a beautiful thing, and we should study it for that reason. For classical schools, this is an issue because it seems intuitively like they have to have a Latin class, but often they don't know why, and they come up with reasons that are not very good. It helps you score better on the SAT or something. And once that starts being your reason, then you're similar to the public schools, where everything is utilitarian and for some kind of usefulness in life. There is a usefulness in learning Latin. It does help with those things, but in terms of the motivation, it needs to be a bit deeper. ultimately it's a beautiful language, and it's our language as people living
Okay. Mhm.
in the West, so to speak. It's our language, and it's going to tie you to a wealth of your own history. As I was saying, and there are so many works of literature only accessible through Latin, and there are so many translated works of literature that are much better read in Latin. And especially as Catholics, there's this wealth, liturgical wealth, of course, that you receive from the Latin language. And so, as I tell my students, that we learn Latin because it's beautiful. It's not all that useful. Okay, there's uses to it, but I don't want to be for that reason. I don't study because it's useful. I study it because it's beautiful.
Someone once told me just a few weeks ago that the study of something that like that is either beautiful or good, and that's merit enough for the subject to be taught and learned, because as human beings we want to take in that the inherent wisdom of those things, I guess, and I think that's what you're telling us.
Yes, and of course other languages are beautiful too, but I mean, this
Hmm.
this language is particularly tied to our history, and so there's a reason that has remained with us long after it was anyone's native tongue.
Hmm. Could you tell us, Dr. Klumpenhouwer, about so the study of philosophy or the sciences, or history, Latin languages, and things like that? There's a hierarchy in the Catholic view of education, with philosophy being at the pinnacle and so on. Could you is that the case these days? And would your students be? I guess they would be exposed to that sort of a hierarchy, would they?
To some degree, it's not built into the curriculum.
Mhm.
Again, I'm teaching middle school at a Catholic classical high school. Perhaps more thought would be given in to building that emphasis and that hierarchy into the curriculum. In our case, it's mostly going to, if that hierarchy is communicated to students, that's going to be on the teacher's own initiative. Certainly in my own case, we don't have philosophy classes at this age,
Yeah.
but I'm teaching them through other means, the basics of philosophy, and you find ways to insert it into the curriculum, through
Yeah.
vocabulary, you know, um, quizzes and so forth, teaching them basic terms of philosophy. But again, at the age that I'm teaching, it's not built into the curriculum, that kind of hierarchy.
Right. Is there logic? Do you teach logic at
I
the
do
same?
teach logic. Yes. So, I mean, really what I'm teaching at is what historically would have been called a grammar school,
Mm,
which would have been preparation for philosophy in the medieval stages of education. But it's teaching them the grammar and the rudiments of logic and so on, that hopefully will provide a fertile ground for when they do study philosophy, hopefully either in high school or college.
yeah. I'm recalling, with really, I mean, I enjoyed studying logic because the fallacy, or the fallacious arguments that some people do, it's
Mm-hmm.
just amazing to me how little sometimes out in the world people even recognize a false argument because of no study of logic. And so I'm actually
Mm-hmm.
here that at the age you're talking about, there's the study of logic.
Yes, yeah, and in a way, working at this classical school is wonderful for me because I wasn't trained. I didn't go to a classical school growing up, and so even for myself, there were these gaps in my education, that I've had to fill as a teacher, and been much enriched by having to teach them. So,
By your own necessity to teach it.
mm-hmm.
So, an area that I'd like to tackle with you for just a moment is, you know, is it fun? Is school, do you make it fun? Should it be fun? Can it be fun? Is that even
Mm-hmm.
a criteria that one should worry about? I had great experiences, and I had, I would say, I don't want to characterize them negatively, but I had tough old Jesuits who were two or three PhDs each, and they were very uh, exemplary in their discipline, but it was actually good for us. And I'm not saying it wasn't fun, but it was challenging. And so how
Mm-hmm.
do you characterize what you do today? I know fun is a buzzword too, but
Mm-hmm. Well, I'd say those things go together. I do enjoy school, and I think if you were to ask my students in a general sense, they also enjoy school, but that happens because of the discipline.
Mhm.
I'd be pretty confident to say that my students, who our school is a strict school, thankfully it has um, uh, proper ways and good discipline to kind of keep things in their proper order. And it's rare. But I think because of that structure that's given, the students are able to have a better time and to have clear expectations and to not have so many worries about, what other students are doing and so forth. So I think that the enjoyment and the discipline go together. And if you are too relaxed on the discipline, the enjoyment actually diminishes. And now, of course, you can go to extremes and be too hard on the discipline, and the enjoyment diminishes. And it's not like the enjoyment is the goal, but this is tied. A person's desire to learn is going to help them learn. And you can't force learning. Like virtue, you can't force learning too much. There needs to be a receptiveness as well. And so as a teacher, that's always, it's a prudential decision, finding the balance between the discipline and the enjoyment. And it's going to change, based on the personality of the teacher. It's going to change based on the personality of the student in the class. And those are prudential decisions that we teachers have to make all the time, how much to have of one and the other.
Last question I have for you on sort of the educational side of things, Dr. Klumpenhouwer. The parents, the parents are the primary educators of the children. We know that as Catholics, and yet you could say you're a proxy for the parent. The role is perhaps, is it delegated to you? Maybe that's the term. But what's that relationship like? How does that actually work out in practice?
Yes, and that's always, I believe strongly in what you just said about the parents being the primary teacher. As a teacher, sometimes I'd say the main issue is that you're not just teaching one student, you're teaching many students who have many different kinds of parents. And so, whatever you do as a teacher is always not going to transpose exactly onto every parent. There's always going to be some parents who are somewhat kind of skeptical of what you're doing, and others very supportive. And so as a teacher, you're kind of navigating certainly the primary role of the parent, but also, the fact that you have to teach 30 different students with 30 different parents. And that's also increasingly as we live in a world where not everyone shares the same culture. And I don't even really mean ethnic culture here, but just culture in a broader sense of, how students should behave and so forth. In other words, when there's less consensus among the parents about how to raise students, it makes it harder as a teacher because not everyone has the same expectations. And so again, there's prudential decisions made all the time, but it's important to have that conviction, and then how it plays out, of course, is the tricky part.
Well, there's certainly, the conclusion that one could draw, the role that you play as a teacher and as a scholar in these fields, so much depends on it. And it's something that I find very, my word valuable comes to mind. That's not the right word, but it's valuable. And because what you do is long lasting and it affects the lives of the next generation. So it's great to see that. I'd like to, we're coming to the natural end of our conversation today. We could say a lot more, and I'd like to invite you back sometime for further conversation. But an opportunity for you to tell us what's important projects that you're working that we can support. How can we support your work, and what would you like to feature today for the audience about what you're doing and studying and researching?
Yes, so along with teaching, I also continue to work as a scholar, transmitting again various medieval works of medieval theology and biblical studies. So if you go to my website, samuelklumpenhouwer.com, you can see some of the project I'm involved in, especially this one we were discussing earlier, this commentary on the Bible, and people are welcome certainly to check that out. And there's one volume available and many more coming, many more in the works.
Right. I hope we can subscribe to a 20-volume series at some point here. That'd be great. Well, great. So thank you, Dr. Klumpenhouwer, for speaking with us today. I think it's a wonderful opportunity for us to have a peek inside of the scholarly world that you live in and the classical education world that you live in. So God bless you and your family and your work. And thanks again for being with us.
Glad to be here. Thank you for the time.
Thank you.